But hopefully this afternoon we're going to have some better sounds for you to listen to. And one of those is going to be our next speaker. Now, I've been following our next speaker on social media for a long time. She's an absolutely gorgeous girl. She has been living with type 1 diabetes practically her whole life. So she's got a lifetime's worth of experience to share with you all today. But I'm really pleased to say that taking you through her journey, the 80s and the 90s, the noughties, the 2000s, she's going to take you on a really, really, really special journey because most recently, last year, she gave birth to a beautiful baby. So I'm really, really, really excited to hear this next talk. And I'm sure all of you guys are going to enjoy it as well. So please, I'd like to introduce Ros Gray.
Hi all, thanks for the warm welcome. As Natalie's just introduced, I'm Ros Gray. Some of you probably know me as Type 1 Adventures if you're on Twitter. And you've probably seen quite a lot more recently about my little one, but we'll come on to that a bit further on. Just before we start, I just need to say that I do work for Roche Diabetes Care, but I'm here today as a patient, not on behalf of Roche Diabetes Care, so anything I say is just my personal opinion. So let's go back to the start, the 1980s. Bit different from where we are now, guys, let me tell you. 1984 was when I was diagnosed. The picture there of me is actually only just a month before I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I looked really well. In fact, I was definitely not losing weight, shall we say, as a baby. Yeah, so that wasn't one of the signs that actually I had, and not actually up until really close to my diagnosis. But I basically went from walking to crawling, crawling to sitting there to just crying all day. And essentially, my parents came down one day, bringing me down from the cot, and I couldn't sit up. And I was just really floppy, and my mum knew that something was really wrong. On the run up to this, I'd had an ear infection, an ear infection, a urine infection, an ear infection, and they just could not get rid of any of the infections. Thankfully, that day, and I will always and forever be thankful for the GP that was there working that day, they decided to come and do a house call and to see me. And the doctor that came out happened to be a specialist in diabetes. She took one look at me and apparently took a sniff of my breath, asked my mum to take my nappy off, put a test strip on and said, get her straight to the hospital. So straight away ketones were showing, and they were told that they couldn't 100% confirm it there and then, but they were pretty much convinced that I had type 1 diabetes. So on the 23rd of January 1984, my parents' lives changed. Now, of course, my life changed, but I didn't know anything about it at the time. So for me, this diagnosis was more about my parents, actually, and about all the things that they had to do. When I was preparing for this talk, I had a conversation with my parents, and I said, what were, other than obviously upset, what were your thoughts at that time? And my mum just said, we weren't sure how we were going to cope. We really worried about your general health, and to be honest, we had no idea what the future was going to hold. So for them, it was such a nerve-wracking time. And they also didn't give them any sort of practice injecting a baby either. So the first time they ever held an injection was as they were giving it to me. So that was definitely a bit of an initiation for them. Moving on to the tech, as Natalie was just talking about tech, this blue bit of kit here, this was the thing you wanted in 1984, guys. Oh, yes. Just to give you a bit of perspective, wasn't much smaller than this bit of paper. So didn't quite fit in your handbag discreetly, and it was definitely not one you could do, without anybody noticing. In fact, this meter that I was given was one off the ward because they were so shocked to see somebody so young with type 1 that they didn't actually have anything there to give me. And it wasn't commonplace for people to have meters then, so they gave me one from the ward. My rubbish claim to fame is that I was the youngest person in the South Wales area to have type 1 diabetes at that time. We heard this morning from George that unfortunately this baby's been diagnosed much younger now. But in 1984, I was the youngest, and to the point that the people who took my blood and actually tested my blood came down to the ward to see if I genuinely was a 13-month-old baby, because they weren't overly convinced that it was coming from me. Talking of technology, we weren't anywhere near the pump stage back then. This meter took 3.5 minutes, which, as my mum mentioned, if you think your baby's having a hypo, is the longest 3.5 minutes of your life. So it definitely wasn't quick, it definitely wasn't speedy, but it was all we had at the time, so we were very grateful for it. And syringes were the thing. My mum told me, I didn't realize this again until I was preparing for this talk. I said to her, how was it giving injections? And she said, well, the first time we used the syringe wasn't too bad. The first time? Oh, well, you had to use them until they were blunt. And that was the approach, because at that time, things were limited, so we had to keep using them. And just to give you an idea, for those who didn't have type 1 diabetes in the 80s, you had to mix your own. So it was a bit of making your own cocktails a little bit. You had a cloudy one and a clear one, your long-acting and your fast-acting that you'd mix up in your own little cocktail. So it would go into one bottle, so that would be the first time it would get a little bit blunt, go into the second bottle, maybe a little bit blunt, so by the time it actually got to your skin, it already pierced something twice. And then you were told to use that injection over and over and over again. And I have vivid memories of giving my own injection and the words coming out of my mouth, "It won't go into my skin, Mum," because you were pressing and it wouldn't go in. So yeah, insulin injections were very different back in the 80s. As I mentioned, the hypos, 3.5 minutes when you're checking your blood sugars when you're hypo is quite a long time. But as a kid of the 80s, I will say that wasn't the worst bit for me. The worst bit was the fact that you treated hypos with milk. Probably guess how well that worked. Not particularly well. So when hypos were a bit more severe and they didn't work, you then stir in a big spoonful of glucose. Anybody putting glucose in their milk at the moment? Not recommended. So I have distinct memories of my mum walking around with a Tupperware bottle thing full of milk. So nice warm milk. If you imagine it's been in her handbag for 3 hours. Stopping in a car park because we're out walking and I've suddenly had a hypo, and then she's scooping in some glucose. And at least, with the warm milk, it did melt quite quickly. But to this day, I can taste it, and I'd be very happy if I never, ever have to repeat that ever again. Up until this point, I was actually only on 1 injection a day. That was how it was treated. So I had 1 injection in the morning, and that was it for the day. So everything was based on what you ate rather than the insulin you took. So this lovely book here, for those who probably in the 80s, anybody recognize this? Any show of hands? The Food Bible. Oh, yes. Basically a color-coded book of foods you can eat freely, your greens, your ambers, be a bit careful, reds, oh, no, no, no. So your decisions were made on those, and it was based on portions as well, so you had an allotted size. Because you only had that 1 injection a day, you had no option of not eating. So there are many memories that I have of me sitting at a dining table with my mum saying, "You're going to have to eat it." But I don't want to. Tough, you've had your insulin, you're going to have to eat. So that insulin given at first thing in the morning dictated what I was going to eat through the whole day. So that was quite a big thing. This top picture here. Pete actually brought one of these, I believe, to when he did his TED talk a few years back, Pete Davis, The Thing of Nightmares. This was finger pricking, 1980s style. A little bit, lots of memories of doing this, because I wasn't quite brave enough to do it. And also having the fact that sometimes it wouldn't release. I don't know if anybody else would do that. So you'd brace yourself, and then it wouldn't actually shoot, and then it would randomly just decide to do it at another time. So yeah, not something I would want to go back to in terms of finger pricking. But by the end of the 80s, we had moved on a bit, and the glucometer then came along and was a bit smaller than my original blue meter. But one thing we were told to do was to cut our test strips into 2s, and then at one point 3s. So we were cutting our test strips as small as we could to get as many tests out, because you were only getting 1 pot of test strips at a time. And although this seems very crude, things were advancing quite quickly in the 1980s. And actually, as much as we're all told and we have these discussions about the cure was only 5 years away at this time, guys. 5 years. I have vivid memories of my dad saying, by the time you're 16, there'll be a cure. There'll be a cure. And that wasn't said because he thought it was a funny thing to say. That was genuinely how things seemed to be moving at the time. So 5 years away, guys. 1990s. You can check out the hair. A bit more of a quiff at times, which as well we had. So 1990s came around, and I'm sort of coming into school time, doing a lot of things in school. And school generally was okay. I'd managed to figure out finger pricking myself on my new snazzy meter, and was quite happy in school until PE came around. Because again, I'm only on 1 injection a day. So strangely, I actually went from 1 injection to 2 injections at this time. So 1 in the morning, 1 in the night, because my blood sugars were so erratic, which just meant a lot more hypos at the time and a lot more glucose in my milk as well, until the lovely Lucozade came along, the good old days of the Lucozade. And finally, there was something that tasted vaguely like it should, was helping to give us treatments. A major step forward as well was the invention of pens. Although it looked really great, it was incredibly heavy, if anybody remembers it. So if you used to hold it, because obviously as a child you've got to hold it quite close and towards the tip, and it used to fall out of your hand every time you did did an injection. And you had to pay for the needles. So you got your insulin, but you didn't get your needles. So you'd have to pay about £28, I think, for a box of 100 needles. So of course we used those over and over again as well. So everything was recycled, shall we say. Meters again were advancing, and they were coming on. So there was loads of diabetes tech advancements. Things were moving a bit more quickly with that. However, it wasn't all great news. Along came for me the issue of school trips. School trips generally were a thing that people look forward to, but I soon discovered that it wasn't something that was going to be open to me. As the only person in my school with type 1 diabetes and being quite young, they didn't want to take responsibility for me. So I have quite, standout moments of sitting in a classroom at home while everybody else is on a school trip. Eventually, they allowed my mum to come on school trips. So what my mum then did was come on every school trip there was, which was not at all cool. But it did mean that I got to go. And so I was very grateful that I could join in with some of my classmates, because for me, that was the one thing I didn't want to do, was stand out. So that, wasn't something that went down well at the time. In terms of advancements again, keto sticks. Prior to this, we had a massive glass jar with these test strips that would take quite a while, and ketone testing at home became a real thing, which made illness and things much more easy to manage, and meant that you can make decisions at home. Although, again, because I was still on the 2 injections a day, a lot of the decisions were taken out of my hands. Along came dextrose tablets. Now, finally, we had a hypo treatment that was a bit more discreet, a bit more subtle, a bit more chalky. So I thought they were really discreet until I realized I had to ask for a glass of water every time I had a hypo because I couldn't swallow them. But they were at least portable, and things were starting to get a bit more kind of manageable in terms of carrying it around, because all of this was going in my bag in school. Finally, in the 1990s, I moved on to MDI. 15 years after having type 1 diabetes, I moved on to MDI. And that, for me, was a huge change. It was a huge change in terms of mindset. So multiple daily injections was a big thing to do that, and to actually have separate fast-acting and slow-acting insulin was a major, major thing. So although the pens were getting a bit more fashionable, they came in colours, they looked like a normal pen, It was going great. I was actually beginning to think, yeah, I can do this. And then a little curveball came round, and hence the picture of a granny up there. I got diagnosed with an underactive thyroid. Not a cool thing when you're 16. I remember distinctly saying, that's what my nan's got. I can't possibly have that. That's what my nan's got. But I was opened up to the world of all the other autoimmune conditions that you can start to inherit. And so I was diagnosed with an underactive thyroid. I did soon realize that it was just taking a tablet. So it wasn't anywhere near as bad as I thought. But at the time, for me, this was more devastating than diabetes, just because it was not a cool thing to have and was definitely not something I wanted anybody to find out. At the bottom here, I've got a picture of the Forest of Dean. This actually was the first time on a trip that I met somebody else who had type 1 diabetes. I was 15, 16. And a local charity organised a trip for people with type 1 diabetes to go away for 2 days. Up until that point, any residentials, any overnight trips, I wasn't allowed to go on with school. The risk assessment said no. So for the first time, I was away from my parents, and I found out that actually that 2 of the people on the trip were in my school. But we didn't know that until we went away to the Forest of Dean, because it just wasn't publicised or wasn't really discussed in school. But for me, that was a huge step to be able to move forward. So by the end of the 90s, we'd seen a few developments again. The tech had moved on a little bit. But the cure, where was that? You remember that 5-year cure? It's now 10 years away, guys. It's been a bit of delay. It wasn't COVID then, but it was a few delays. It was 10 years away. 10 years away to the cure. 2000s. Okay. We're now getting into the time of adulthood, or me thinking I was an adult, should I say. For lots of different reasons, the 2000s were a navigation time. My first one was learning to drive. Very, very excited to go on my first driving lesson until the first thing I did was have a hypo. And spent most of the session parked up on the side street in a hypo, and I basically got to turn the ignition on and turn it off. And that was it for my first lesson. So navigating that, because although nerves and stress would often raise my blood sugars, for some reason they also decided to give me hypos as well. So I couldn't predict which way it was going to go until I sat in the car, had to do a finger prick, sitting there waiting to decide whether I was actually going to have my driving lesson that day or not. But the one beauty was that the machines had come on. The meters and things that we had come on a long way, and they were much quicker, much more discreet, and much easier to use. But what wasn't so easy to navigate was alcohol and relationships. First step into dating, going out with a guy, debating, when do I tell him I've got type 1? Do I tell him I've got type 1? What if he doesn't like me if I've got type 1? Decided, okay, I'll tell him. Got there, very quickly decided I wasn't going to tell him because I wasn't going to see him again. So I'll keep that one to myself. And then I had a hypo. So not only did I have a hypo, I had a hypo where I had to have my parents called. So that was my great first date. So yeah, navigating those things was an interesting time. Alcohol. Again, for those who were drinking in the 90s, this colour is what most drinks came in, yeah. If they weren't full of about 15 e-colorings, you weren't drinking alcohol. So alcopops were a major thing. So not only did you have alcohol dropping your blood sugars, you had all the sugar boosting them. So then it was the whole guess of how much insulin should you give. But of course, I wasn't carb counting at this point. It was multiple daily injections. So what in reality happened is that alcohol drops your blood sugars, so I drank the alcohol, and then I'd eat on top of it to raise my blood sugars, and then wonder why my blood sugars were 25 the next day. So again, lots of things to consider. As part of being in that adult kind of time, it came independence and moving out. Much to my happiness, much to my parents' horror. Suddenly, I was fully in charge of my diabetes. So moving out was a big, big thing, and so much so that I decided to go all the way down the road to the university. So yeah, I went really local because I was actually a little bit scared of what might happen. But much to my parents' delight, I came out of university with a degree and relatively unscathed, and I managed to do quite well in my degree. And then we moved on to the next thing, a job. So similar to what I said earlier about dating, I had the same debate about jobs. When do I tell them I've got type 1? Do I say it during the interview? Do I say it once I've got the job? Will it be a problem? And although that might sound really silly and strange in today's time, that was actually a major thing at that moment in time, because it wasn't discussed. You didn't tell people about type 1 diabetes openly. And so I had major concerns about how they would react to me having type 1 diabetes. Again, diabetes or autoimmune conditions decided to throw me another curveball, and I got celiac disease. So, gluten-free time. And again, gluten-free in early 2000s was not what it was now. It was bread on prescription that tasted like cardboard, and that was about it. That was your gluten-free diet. So things were a lot different at that time, and I'd learned how to manage my life, eating all the food that I'd been eating for many years, and suddenly had to change everything. So my whole diabetes was thrown out completely with that, and while I adjusted to a gluten-free diet. That middle picture is a prison. I didn't go to prison, just to clarify that. That links to my job. So as I mentioned earlier, I was worried about when I should disclose to people that I had type 1 diabetes. I also decided to go into a bit of a difficult career as well for type 1 diabetes and tech, because I decided to work in a prison. And funny enough, there's quite a lot of risk assessments about you carrying injections around with you in a prison. So that was something I really hadn't thought about. I was very excited about doing something a bit different, but I wasn't prepared for the fact that, as quite often happens, you get what's called locked down when somebody decides to misbehave, shall we say, and you're trapped in there. Now, trapped in there with all your food supplies and tech isn't a problem. Trapped in there with nothing is a bit more of an issue. So that was a big learning curve and lots of risk assessments, but I did manage to work there for 4.5 years. So I did 4.5 years in prison. And eventually, I managed to get onto a carb counting course. My carb counting course didn't come until I'd had type 1 diabetes for 27 years. That was the first education that I had. It's the first education that was aimed at me, and it's the first education that I was given that my parents didn't attend. And for me, it was life-changing. Life-changing not only because I learned a different way of managing my diabetes, but because I actually got to speak to people who had type 1 diabetes, and I got to chat and find out about different things as well. And as part of that, that led on to the next decade. By the way, the cure had stopped being mentioned a little bit by this point. And we were focusing on tech. So I started hearing about people wearing sensors and asking questions about it in my clinic. I was told that I could get a sensor maybe at some point, but by this point, I don't know if any of you realize I'm quite stubborn and a bit forward-thinking, so I thought, I'll buy one and see what's going on. And this was my chart. I had a bit of a shock. I'd had type 1 diabetes for a long time, but I blatantly wasn't doing what I thought I was doing at that time. So this was my first attempt at carb counting. Let's just say I needed to work on it a little bit. But from that tech, what I did have was valuable information. So much more information than I'd had before, and so I could make decisions on things. And from the conversations during those carb counting courses, people started mentioning social media. Now, I was on, MSN and MySpace and all those things previously, but I didn't know anything about diabetes being on social media. So I decided to start investigating and discovered a whole new world. And that was when I started blogging as Type 1 Adventures. My perspective was that diabetes did have its downsides, but it also had its upsides. I had done things that I never thought I would have done because I think I was determined to prove that diabetes wouldn't stop me. And so for me, it was always about the highs and the lows of Type 1. And I thought, we've got this sorted. I'm carb counting, it's going great. And then change came again. Suddenly, I became massively insulin sensitive, which is not what most people normally do, as they've had Type 1 diabetes for a long time, but I did. And I was suddenly on less insulin than I was on when I was 16. So after trying to do multiple injections, and I was doing about 15 or 16 injections a day, I couldn't keep doing it. I stopped driving because I would have too many hypos, and I eventually got onto a pump. And this chart, believe it or not, was I think 24 hours into being on a pump. We went from this to this. Now, I'd love to say that's how it stayed and we could end the PowerPoint here, but it didn't. Okay, but what I did discover from chatting to people was the GB doc, and some of you will probably see your faces up on here. There are so many people that I've met, but what I realized was how much peer support counted and how much peer support was needed. I really learned so much from so many people. I didn't have a clue about pump therapy or sensors or anything until I started speaking to people. When I was on my carb counting course, we all had to bring in a meal and bolus for it during the carb counting course. And we all brought out our injections because I wasn't on a pump at that time. And we started to do our injections, and everybody recoiled in horror when I pulled out my injection. And they said, "Why are you injecting with a spear?" My needles were 10 millimeters. Everybody else was on a 4. And the response of the people in the room was, "Well, why aren't you using the other ones?" But I didn't know. We're using them for years, never had any problems. So the key thing there was I realized that I needed to educate myself, and I went out searching for the information to educate myself. And from these groups and the people that I met, I heard about closed looping and decided that was a journey that I would start on. And that led me right into present day. And then COVID happened. So I started closed looping and then very quickly had to make sure that I was doing it right. But the one thing that came out of doing that during the pandemic is that I didn't need to go anywhere for people to see my results. It was all online. Consultants could see it, check on it. Oh, make a tweak here, make a tweak there. And that was definitely needed because I fell pregnant as well. So as much as this book here, Pregnancy with Type 1 Diabetes, was amazing, and I would highly recommend it in terms of insights into it, the tech, I couldn't have done it without the tech. I really couldn't have. And I'm so grateful for being able to navigate pregnancy and Type 1 diabetes with that there in hand. Thankfully, my little one came along safely, and she was well, and you can see her peeking, give me the beady eye in that picture there, and she's still exactly the same now. And as well as doing that, we also set up the artist groups, and we're able to do online conferences and events and things at the same time. So that, for me, I found that the tech was wider than just the diabetes tech that I was wearing. It was the diabetes tech that we were engaging other people with and staying connected throughout it all. Of course, tech and babies doesn't always quite go to plan, so I have lost a few cannulas due to toes along the way. But we're getting there, and we're navigating. And as I look to the future, I'm probably not looking for the cure of 5 years anymore, but I do feel that we've come such a long way. That's fine, because we're working towards it, and the tech that I've got now means that I can do whatever I need to do. And if I can bring a little one into the world, then we're all good. So as I look to the future, absolutely, as we've all discussed, we'd definitely like the cure to be just around the corner and not 10 years away. But in the meantime, I think we're doing pretty okay. So I just want to say thank you so much to everybody for listening, but also thank you to everybody who has been a big part of my journey, because Without you, I definitely wouldn't be where I am today. Thanks very much.